That cold morning, no one expected an act of compassion to change everything. What started as another quiet day near the reserve became a story the whole town tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, every roar and every breath matters, because behind every white tiger there is a story worth saving. The frost clung to the edges of the old wooden fence like a fragile promise, the kind that breaks under the weight of winter's indifference. It was dawn in the shadow of the Whispering Pines Reserve, a sprawling stretch of forest on the outskirts of a forgotten Montana town, where the air hung heavy with the scent of pine needles and distant rain. The highway hummed faintly in the distance, a lifeline to the world beyond. But here, in this quiet corner, the only sounds were the crunch of boots on frozen ground and the labored breaths of something wild breaking through the silence. Old man Harlan Jenkins had been up since before the stars faded, his routine as unyielding as the mountains that framed his modest cabin. At 68, Harlan was a relic of the reserve's early days, a former ranger turned solitary caretaker, his hands calloused from years of mending fences and coaxing life from stubborn soil. He wasn't one for company. The townfolk called him gruff, a man who traded conversation for the company of strays. His only companion these days was a weathered border collie named Scout, a loyal shadow with fur the color of autumn leaves, eyes sharp and knowing. Scout had been with Harlan for a decade, ever since she'd wandered up to his door as a pup, half-starved and trembling. They understood each other in the way of those who'd both known loss, Harlan after his wife passed, Scout after whatever ghosts haunted her past. That morning, as Harlan stepped out onto the porch, with a tin mug of black coffee steaming in his grip, Scout's ears perked up first. She let out a low whine, not her usual alert bark, but something deeper, laced with urgency. Her nose twitched toward the tree line, where the forest met the edge of Harlan's property, a no-man's land of overgrown brush and fallen logs. Harlan followed her gaze, squinting against the pale light. At first he saw nothing, just the usual mist rolling in from the creek, the kind that turned the world into a watercolor blur. But then a sound cut through, a ragged, guttural rumble, like wind tearing through a hollow tree. Not thunder, not a bear, something alive, suffering. He set the mug down, his heart picking up a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. Scout bolted ahead, her paws kicking up frost as she darted toward the sound. Harlan grabbed his coat and followed, boots slipping on the slick path. The reserve wasn't far, maybe a mile through the trees, but this felt too close, too immediate. As they pushed through the underbrush, the air grew thicker, carrying the faint, musky tang of wet fur and something metallic, like earth turned over too soon. Harlan's breath came in clouds, his mind racing through possibilities. A wounded deer, perhaps, or one of the coyotes that prowled the edges. But deep down, he knew the reserve held rarer secrets. White tigers, escaped or smuggled, no one could say for sure, had been whispered about in town for years. Legends, mostly. Born from blurry trail cam photos and half-heard roars on moonless nights. They broke into a small clearing, a natural dip in the land where the creek widened into a shallow pool, now iced at the edges. There, slumped against a moss-covered boulder, was the tigress. She was magnificent even in her agony, a white tiger, her coat like fresh snow dusted with faint black stripes. Eyes the color of storm clouds half-lidded in exhaustion. Her flanks heaved with each breath, a deep wheezing rhythm that echoed in the still air. Blood stained the ground beneath her, not a flood, but enough to darken the frost, a testament to the battle she was fighting alone. She was in labor, that much was clear from the way her body tensed and released, her massive paws kneading the earth as if to anchor herself against the pain. 3 small forms stirred faintly at her side, cubs, no bigger than house cats, slick and mewling weakly, their white fur matted and eyes still sealed shut. But the fourth, it hadn't come. She roared then, a sound that was more plea than threat, raw and breaking, vibrating through Harlan's chest like a warning from the wild itself. Scout stopped short, her hackles rising, but she didn't flee. Instead, she crept forward, nose low, whining softly as if sensing the desperation in the air. Harlan froze, his pulse thundering. White tigers weren't native here. This one must have been poached, abandoned, driven to the edges by whatever cruel hand had brought her to this place. The town would call for authorities, for tranquilizers and cages, labeling her a danger to livestock and lives. But looking at her now, those eyes locking onto his for a fleeting moment, not with ferocity, but with a silent, exhausted trust, Harlan felt something shift inside him. She wasn't a monster. She was a mother, fighting for breath, for her young, in a world that had already turned its back. He knelt slowly, hands trembling as he shrugged off his coat. The cold bit into his skin, but he ignored it, inching closer while Scout circled protectively. The tigress lifted her head, a low growl rumbling in her throat, but it faded into a shuddering sigh. One cub nuzzled blindly toward the warmth of Harlan's discarded coat, its tiny body quivering. Harlan's throat tightened. Memories flooded him unbidden of his own daughter, lost too young to fever, her small hand slipping from his in a hospital bed miles from here. He'd failed her then, too wrapped in his grief to fight harder. But this was different. A chance to do something, anything, against the indifference of the world. "If we don't help her," he murmured to Scout, his voice cracking in the quiet, "no one will." The dog tilted her head, as if understanding, and pressed against his side. Harlan reached out, not touching the tigress yet, but close enough to feel the heat radiating from her body. Her breath hitched, a warm gust against his fingers, and in that moment, the forest seemed to hold its own breath. The highway's distant hum faded, leaving only the tigress's labored rises and falls, the soft cries of her cubs, and the weight of a decision that would unravel everything Harlan thought he knew about survival, loyalty, and the bonds that form in the shadow of fear. Far off, the first rays of sun pierced the mist, casting long shadows across the clearing. But for Harlan and Scout, the morning had just begun, a quiet act of compassion that would draw them into a story of instinct and redemption, where a dog's unwavering heart would bridge the impossible divide between worlds. Harlan's hand hovered in the chill air, inches from the tigress's flank, where her white fur rose and fell like waves crashing against a hidden shore. The clearing felt smaller now, the trees closing in like silent witnesses, their branches etched black against the paling sky. Scout sat rigid beside him, her breath steady and warm against his leg, a quiet anchor in the storm of the moment. The tigress's eyes, those stormy depths, held his for a beat longer than fear should allow. Not a challenge, but a question, raw and unspoken. Her body convulsed again, a deep tremor that shook loose a spray of frost from the boulder, and Harlan knew time was slipping away like sand through calloused fingers. He moved with the caution of a man who'd learned the hard way that the wild doesn't forgive haste. First the cubs, the three tiny forms already stirring at her side, their mules faint as whispers in the wind. He scooped them up one by one, wrapping them in the folds of his coat, their bodies no heavier than the regrets he carried. They were warm against his chest, slick with the remnants of birth, their blind faces turning instinctively toward any source of heat. Scout nosed them gently, her tongue darting out to clean the smallest one, a soft maternal rhythm that surprised even Harlan. She'd never had pups of her own, not since he'd found her, but here she was, claiming them with a tenderness that bridged the impossible. The tigress watched, her growl reduced to a ragged exhale, as if granting permission in her final strength. Harlan placed the bundled cubs near Scout, who curled around them like a living hearth, her tail sweeping the ground in slow, protective arcs. The dog's eyes never left the mother, mirroring Harlan's own mix of awe and sorrow. He turned back to the tigress, his knees sinking into the damp earth. "Easy now," he whispered, more to himself than to her, his voice lost in the hush. He didn't touch her wounds, the gash along her side from whatever chase or trap had brought her here, but he pressed his palms flat against the ground beside her, feeling the vibrations of her struggle through the soil. Another contraction hit, fiercer this time, her massive frame arching as a low, keening sound escaped her throat. It wasn't a roar of dominance, but a mother's cry, echoing the isolation of the forest itself. Harlan's breath caught, his mind flashing to hospital rooms, long buried in memory. Sterile lights, beeping machines, the helplessness of watching life slip away. He couldn't save his daughter then, but here, in this frozen clearing, he could at least bear witness. The tigress's sides heaved once more, and then, with a final shuddering effort, the fourth cub emerged, smaller than the others, its white fur almost translucent, body limp and still. Harlan reached for it without thinking, cradling the tiny form in his rough hands. It didn't stir, its chest barely rising, the umbilical cord trailing like a fragile lifeline. Panic clawed at him, but he forced it down, rubbing the cub gently with the edge of his sleeve, willing warmth into its cold limbs. Scout shifted, nosing closer, her warm breath mingling with his efforts. A miracle in miniature, the cub let out a weak, sputtering cry, its mouth opening to the air as color flushed its tiny body. Harlan's eyes burned, unshed tears blurring the scene. He placed it with its siblings, where Scout immediately took over, licking it clean with devoted strokes, her instincts overriding any sense of species or strangeness. But the tigress, her breaths grew shallower, each one a labored pull against the inevitable. She lifted her head one last time, gaze sweeping over her cubs, now huddled under Scout's watchful care. There was no fear in her eyes, only a profound weariness, as if she'd run the length of the world to reach this point, and found it enough. Her massive paw twitched, extending toward the bundle of life she'd created, but it fell short, sinking into the frost. A final sigh escaped her, warm and fading, carrying the scent of wild meadows and untamed rivers. Her chest stilled, the forest falling into a deeper silence, broken only by the distant call of a crow wheeling overhead. Harlan sat back on his heels, the weight of her passing settling over him like the morning mist. She was gone, a ghost of the reserve's hidden wilds, her story ending not in glory, but in quiet surrender. The town would hear of this soon enough. Rumors spread faster than wildfires here, and with them would come the judgments. "Dangerous beast," they'd say, "better off put down." But Harlan saw the truth in her final gaze, a creature driven to the brink, trusting a stranger in her most vulnerable hour. He stroked Scout's head, feeling the steady thrum of her loyalty. "We can't leave 'em," he murmured, the words heavy with resolve. The cubs were orphans now, their mother's fierce protection reduced to memory. Gathering them all, 4 fragile lives wrapped in his coat, Harlan rose, Scout flanking him as they made their way back through the trees. The path felt longer, the cold seeping deeper, but the cub's soft warmth against his chest fueled his steps. His cabin loomed ahead, a squat sanctuary of weathered logs and flickering lantern light. Inside, he cleared a space by the hearth, stoking the fire until flames danced shadows across the walls. Scout took charge without prompt, nosing the cubs into a nest of blankets, her body curving around them like a shield. They rooted blindly toward her, mistaking her for their lost mother, and she allowed it, her tail wagging faintly in the firelight. As the day wore on, Harlan paced the creaking floorboards, phone in hand but undialed. Calling the authorities meant cages, tests, separation. The cubs shipped off to some distant facility, Scout's budding bond severed. No, this was his burden now, a secret forged in frost and first light. He watched from his chair as Scout groomed them one by one, her tongue patient and sure, drawing mews of contentment from their tiny throats. The fourth cub, the weakest, clung closest to her side, its breaths syncing with hers in a rhythm of survival. Outside, the highway whispered its endless song, a reminder of the world beyond these walls. But in the quiet warmth of the cabin, something new was taking root. A family pieced together from loss, where a dog's heart became the bridge to the wild. Harlan leaned back, exhaustion pulling at him, yet a spark of hope flickered in his chest. These cubs, with their mother's spirit etched in every stripe, deserved more than indifference, and Scout, ever faithful, seemed to know it best, her eyes meeting his across the room, steady as the stars emerging one by one through the window. The sun dipped low, painting the reserve in hues of amber and shadow, but the real story was just unfolding. 3 cubs, wait 4, destined to grow under the unlikely care of a border collie, their paths twisting toward an unthinkable future where loyalty would be tested and the wild would reclaim what was owed. For now, though, in the hush of the cabin, breath mingled with breath, and the frost outside began to thaw. The days blurred into a rhythm of firelight and shadowed vigilance, the cabin transforming into a fragile world unto itself. Harlan's hands, once idle with the monotony of solitude, now moved with purpose, mixing formula from tins scavenged from the reserve's old supply shed, warming bottles over the stove until the milk steamed like morning breath on glass. The cubs, those 4 miracles of white fur and hidden stripes, demanded everything, their mules piercing the night like distant sirens, pulling him from uneasy sleep to kneel beside Scout's nest. She was the heart of it all, her body a living cradle, allowing the cubs to nuzzle against her belly, even though her own milk had long dried up. It was instinct, overriding impossibility, her warmth and scent weaving a spell of safety that kept their tiny hearts beating in sync. The 4th cub, the runt as Harlan came to think of it, struggled most. Born last, it was the smallest. Its body a fragile wisp compared to the others, fur so pale it seemed to glow in the hearth's flicker. Harlan named them in whispers during those long nights. Luna for the boldest, with eyes that cracked open first to reveal icy blue depths. Shadow for the quiet one, always curling into the folds of blankets. Ember for the fiery spirit that poured at Scout's muzzle with surprising vigor. And the runt, Ghost, for the way it hovered on the edge of life, its breath shallow as a sigh caught in the wind. Scout sensed it too. She licked Ghost more insistently, her tongue rasping gently over its limp form, as if willing strength from her own unyielding frame. Outside, winter tightened its grip, snow drifting against the windows like forgotten letters, sealing the cabin in isolation. Harlan ventured out only for wood and provisions, his truck rumbling down the empty highway to the edge of town, where the general store's neon sign buzzed like a hesitant heartbeat. He avoided eyes there, Mrs. Ellis behind the counter with her sharp gaze and sharper tongue, or young Tommy the mechanic, who idled by the pumps, swapping stories of reserve sightings. "Heard a roar last week," Tommy might say, voice low as if sharing contraband. Harlan would nod, grunt something non-committal, his mind on the cubs waiting in the warmth. But the weight of secrecy pressed heavier each trip. One slip, one curious question, and the authorities would descend, wildlife experts with nets and sedatives, turning his sanctuary into a spectacle. Back home, the bond deepened in silences broken only by the crackle of logs. Scout never wavered, her border collie instincts adapting to these wild charges with a devotion that humbled Harlan. She'd heard them gently when they began to toddle, her nose nudging Luna away from the hearth's edge, or lie still as Ember clambered over her back, tiny claws pricking without protest. Ghost, though, remained apart, its attempts to nurse feeble, body cooling faster than the others, despite the blankets Harlan layered around it. One evening, as dusk bled purple through the frost-laced panes, the cub's cries faltered into whimpers that twisted Harlan's gut. He lifted Ghost carefully, feeling the rapid flutter beneath its ribs, like a bird trapped in a cage too small. Kneeling by the fire, Harlan cradled it against his chest, the bottle's nipple slipping into its slack mouth. Milk dribbled unused, and panic rose unbidden, echoes of that hospital room, his daughter's fevered form slipping despite the doctor's assurances. "Fight, little one," he murmured, his voice rough as gravel, rubbing Ghost's back with a thumb scarred from years of fences and falls. Scout pressed close, her head resting on his knee, eyes fixed on the cub with a quiet plea. The other 3 cubs stirred in their nest, Luna's eyes now half open, watching with newborn curiosity, as if sensing the fragility in the air. Harlan's mind raced through options, each shadowed by doubt. The reserve vet, Dr. Lena Morrow, lived 20 miles down the winding road, a woman of quiet steel, who'd patched up Scout years ago after a run-in with barbed wire. She'd understand the rarity, the risk, but calling her meant exposure. The town already whispered of white tigers as omens, pests to be culled for the sake of ranches and roads. "They're not ours to keep," Harlan told himself, but the words rang hollow against the cub's weakening pulse. Scout whined low, her paw tapping his leg insistently, as if urging him toward the phone on the wall. In the end, compassion won its slow victory. Harlan dialed under the cover of night, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Lena, it's Harlan. Got something? Unusual. Need your eyes. Quiet-like." She arrived at dawn, her truck's tires crunching snow as it pulled up to the cabin, headlights cutting through the gray like hesitant hope. Lena was in her 40s, wiry and weathered, her kit slung over one shoulder, face etched with the lines of too many lost causes. She paused at the door, scenting the air, musk and milk and something primal, before stepping inside without a word. Her eyes widened at the sight, Scout encircled by the cubs, Ghost limp in Harlan's arms. No exclamations. Just a sharp intake of breath as she knelt, gloved hands gentle as she examined the runt. "How?" she whispered finally, her voice a thread in the quiet. Harlan met her gaze, the story spilling out in fragments, the tigress, the labor, the death in the clearing. Lena listened, her focus on Ghost, administering fluids from a syringe, warming its body with heated pads. "She's fighting infection, dehydration," Lena said, her tone clinical but laced with something softer. "The mother's passing left them vulnerable, but this one, it's a miracle it's lasted this long." As Lena worked, the other cub stirred, Shadow batting at her boot with a paw, drawing a rare smile. Scout watched every move, tense but trusting, her loyalty extending now to this intruder in their haven. Harlan stood back, arms crossed against the chill of revelation. What if Lena reported it? But her eyes, when they met his, held no judgment, only the shared weight of choices made in the dead of night. "We'll save her," Lena said, wrapping Ghost in a fresh cloth, its chest rising steadier now. "If we don't, what does that say about us?" The morning light strengthened, filtering through the windows to gild the scene in gold. Outside, the snow began to melt in patches, revealing the earth's patient green beneath. Harlan felt the shift, a family expanding, fragile bonds forging in the face of loss. But as Ghost's eyes flickered open for the first time, mirroring the tigress's stormy depths, Harlan wondered at the cost. These cubs weren't pets, they were wild at heart, growing stronger by the day under Scout's watchful care. The highway hummed on, indifferent, but inside, breaths aligned in quiet defiance, hinting at tensions yet to rise, when play turned to power, and the unthinkable loomed on the horizon of their unlikely home. Weeks turned to months, in the cocoon of the cabin, the winter's iron grip yielding to a tentative spring that seeped through the cracks like whispered promises. The snow melted into rivulets that fed the creek, carrying away the last traces of frost, and leaving the earth raw and awakening. Inside, the air hummed with the soft patter of growing pores and the low rumble of contented throats, a symphony that masked the undercurrent of change. Harlan's world had narrowed to the rhythm of feedings and play, his days measured not by the sun's arc, but by the cubs' milestones, their eyes fully opening to the fire's glow, their first clumsy stumbles across the worn floorboards, the way their white coats thickened into plush armor against the lingering chill. Scout remained the unwavering center, her border collie frame now a playground for 4 burgeoning predators. Luna led the charge, her blue eyes sharp and inquisitive, pouncing on shadows with a ferocity that belied her size. She'd chase Scout's tail in endless circles, tiny roars escaping her throat like muffled thunder, while Shadow preferred the quiet corners, curling into Harlan's lap during evenings by the hearth, his paw resting lightly on the old man's knee, as if seeking stories in the silence. Ember was the wild spark, batting at anything that moved. Harlan's bootlaces, Lena's stethoscope during her weekly visits, his energy a whirlwind that left Scout panting but patient. And Ghost, the miracle, had bloomed slowest but surest, her body filling out until she matched her siblings, though her gaze held a deeper stillness, as if carrying echoes of the mother she'd never known. Lena's visits became a ritual, her truck's rumble a herald of hope amid the isolation. She'd arrive with supplies, raw meat pureed for weaning, vitamins pilfered from the reserve stock, her face a map of quiet determination. "They're thriving," she'd say, her voice soft as she checked weights and temperatures, gloved hands lingering on Ghost's flank, but her eyes always flicked to the windows, to the tree line beyond, where the reserve's boundary blurred into freedom. "Harlan, they're not house cats. Soon they'll need space, real space, the wild's in their blood." He'd nod, jaw set, but the words hung heavy, a shadow over the warmth. Calling Lena had been a risk. Her silence was a gift, born from her own ghosts, a failed marriage, a clinic overrun by bureaucracy that prioritized paperwork over lives. Saving these cubs was her redemption, a small defiance against a system that labeled rarity as threat. Harlan felt it too, the moral tug-of-war sharpening with each passing day. The cubs' play had evolved from kittenish tumbles to something primal, mock hunts where Luna pinned Ember with a growl that vibrated the floor, Shadow's stealthy approaches ending in pounces that scattered blankets like fallen leaves. Scout adapted, her herding instincts twisting into games of evasion, darting just out of reach to draw them into chases that ended in exhausted heaps by the fire. But there were moments of unease. Ghost's sudden stillness when a door creaked, her ears flattening as if remembering the clearing's chill. Ember's teeth grazing too hard during nursing, drawing a wince from Scout that Harlan pretended not to see. The dog never complained, her loyalty a quiet force, but Harlan caught her limping once after a particularly vigorous tussle, her paw tender from a playful nip. One afternoon, as rain drummed the tin roof like impatient fingers, the tension crested in a way that forced Harlan's hand. He'd stepped out to chop wood, axe biting into logs with rhythmic thuds that echoed his unease. The cubs, now the size of large foxes, roamed the cabin under Scout's watchful eye, their white forms weaving through furniture like ghosts in daylight. Lena had just left, her parting words, "They're getting too big for this. The reserve has protocols," lingering like smoke. Harlan paused mid-swing, wiping sweat from his brow, when a sharp yelp pierced the air from inside. He dropped the axe, heart slamming, and burst through the door. The scene froze him. Luna and Ember in a tangle, their growls low and serious, bodies rolling across the rug in a blur of fur and fangs. Shadow watched from the corner, tail twitching, while Ghost circled the fray, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Scout stood between them and the hearth, hackles raised, barking sharply, a command born of instinct, herding them apart. But Ember, in his youthful bravado, lunged past her, knocking over a chair with a crash that splintered wood. The cubs scattered, mewling in surprise, but Scout pressed forward, nosing Luna back with a firmness that bordered on warning. Harlan's breath hitched. These weren't games anymore. The wild was stirring, instincts sharpening into something that could no longer be contained by blankets and bottles. He knelt amid the chaos, hands outstretched, voice low and steady. "Easy now, easy." The cubs responded to his tone, as they always had, perhaps mistaking it for their mother's rumble, huddling close as Scout settled beside him, her side heaving from the effort. Ghost nuzzled her flank first, a soft rumble vibrating from her chest, and the others followed, their apology in touches and sighs. Harlan stroked Scout's ears, feeling the tremor in her frame, the first crack in her unbreakable vigil. "You're doing more than I ever could," he whispered, throat tight with the weight of it all. Outside, the rain softened to a drizzle, washing the world clean, but inside the cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in on secrets too big to hold. That night, as thunder rolled distant over the reserve, Harlan sat by the window, the cubs asleep in a pile with Scout at their core. The highway lights flickered like hesitant stars, a reminder of the world waiting to judge. He'd failed once, letting loss define him, but here, in the hush of breaths entwining, he saw a different path. Redemption not in keeping them forever, but in preparing them for what came next. Lena was right. Space was coming. Whether through the back door to the woods or the cold hand of authority, the cubs stirred in their dreams, paws twitching toward hunts yet to come, and Harlan wondered at the bond Scout had forged, a mother's heart in a dog's faithful form. But as Ghost's eyes cracked open in the dark, locking onto his with that stormy knowing, he felt the pull of the wild, hinting at trials ahead where loyalty would be tested, and the unthinkable edged closer, like a shadow lengthening at dusk. Spring unfurled its tentative greens across the reserve, the creek swelling with meltwater that murmured secrets through the underbrush, carrying the scent of damp earth and budding life. The cabin, once a bastion of quiet isolation, now pulsed with an energy that strained its walls, paws thumping against floorboards, low growls rumbling like distant thunder, the occasional scrape of claws testing the boundaries of their world. Harlan's mornings began with the dawn chorus of mews turned to chuffs, the cubs now sleek adolescents, their bodies lengthening into the promise of power, white coats gleaming like polished marble under the slanting light. Luna led with unyielding curiosity, her frame the largest, muscles rippling beneath fur as she paced the room, eyes scanning for outlets to the unknown. Shadow moved like mist, silent and observant, while Ember's energy crackled, his pounces more forceful, scattering rugs and toppling stools. Ghost, ever the quiet anchor, shadowed Scout most closely, her stormy gaze mirroring the dog's steadfast watch. Scout's devotion held, but the toll etched itself in subtle ways, her steps slower on the uneven floors, a faint limp from a recent tumble where Ember's play had veered into earnest grip. She still curled around them at night, her body a warm curve amid their sprawling forms. But the cubs no longer fit neatly against her side. They'd outgrown the nest, their heads now level with hers when seated, nuzzling her with jaws that could crush bone if unchecked. Harlan watched it all from the edges, his coffee cooling untouched on the table, heart heavy with the arithmetic of impossibility. These weren't strays to be tamed, they were echoes of the wild, their mother's fierce legacy stirring in every stretch and yawn. Lena's visits grew more frequent, her truck's arrival a punctuation in the lengthening days, tires churning mud as she pulled up with crates of meat and quiet warnings. "They're juveniles now," she said one overcast afternoon, her voice low as she examined Ember's paw, the cubs submitting with a patience born of trust. The air hung thick with the scent of raw venison, the cubs tearing into chunks on the porch while Scout supervised from the steps, her ears flicking at every snap. Lena's eyes, sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, met Harlan's over the cubs' heads. The reserve's fencing won't hold them forever, and if word gets out... She trailed off, glancing toward the highway where a semi rumbled past. Its horn, a blunt intrusion. Harlan nodded, jaw tight, the silence between them filled with the unspoken, poachers' traps, bureaucratic seizures, the cold finality of relocation to some sterile zoo where instincts withered in concrete pens. That evening, as twilight bled indigo through the windows, the first real fracture appeared. Harlan had reinforced the doors with extra latches, but the cub's restlessness had evolved into probing tests. Luna's nose under the frame, Shadow's body leaning against it with calculated weight. He'd stepped out to the shed for tools, leaving Scout to guard the interior, her barks a familiar reassurance. But when he returned, the air inside hummed with tension, the door ajar just inches, splinters glinting on the threshold where claws had pried. Scout stood in the gap, body braced, her growl a low vibration that set Harlan's pulse racing. Beyond her, Luna's form filled the frame, her massive head tilted, eyes locked on the open expanse of yard fading into trees. "Back," Harlan commanded softly, his voice steady despite the chill snaking down his spine. Luna hesitated, her breath fogging the air, then retreated with a huff, but the moment lingered like a held breath. Scout nosed the door shut, her paw trembling as she pressed against it, and Harlan knelt beside her, hands stroking her flank. "You held 'em," he murmured, feeling the rapid beat beneath her ribs, the exhaustion in her stance. The other cubs gathered, Ghost pressing close to Scout's side, her rumble a soothing counterpoint to the dog's labored exhale. Harlan's mind reeled. One push, one lapse, and they'd vanish into the reserve, drawing eyes, questions, the inexorable pull of the law. Sleep evaded him that night, the cabin creaking under the weight of what-ifs. He sat by the hearth, flames casting flickering shadows that danced like warnings across the walls. Scout lay nearby, the cubs piled against her, their breaths deep and even, bodies now nearly her size in repose. Memories surfaced unbidden, his daughter's laughter echoing in a sunlit yard, cut short by illness's cruel theft. The tigress's final gaze in the clearing, trusting in her dying light. Harlan had built this fragile family from those ruins, Scout's loyalty the mortar holding it together. But redemption demanded more than shelter, it required release, a moral crossroads where keeping them meant endangering all. Dawn brought Lena again, unannounced this time, her knock sharp against the wood. She entered with a map unrolled under her arm, face drawn from a sleepless night. "I couldn't sleep on it," she said, spreading the paper on the table amid the scent of cooling coffee. The cubs stirred, Luna approaching with cautious interest, her nose twitching at the unfamiliar lines of trails and fences. Lena traced a path with her finger, the reserve's heart, a secluded glade where white tigers might blend into legend rather than captivity. "We stage it," she whispered, voice laced with the gravity of conspiracy. "Nights when the roads are empty, let them go in pairs, acclimate them slow." Harlan's throat tightened, the plan a bridge over the chasm of loss, but Scout's whine from the corner pulled his gaze. She watched them, head on paws, as if sensing the unraveling. As the day wore on, the cubs' energy peaked in the yard. Harlan's reinforced pen, a temporary cage of chain link and posts. Ember charged the fence, his body slamming with a thud that rattled the ground, Shadow joining in silent solidarity. Scout barked from inside, her herding calls drawing them back, but her voice cracked on the third round, body sagging against the gate. Ghost lingered by Harlan's side, her paw on his boot, eyes pleading in that profound way that stripped him bare. Lena knelt beside Scout, checking her over with gentle hands. "She's worn thin," she said softly. No judgment, only the shared ache. They love her, but they need their world. Harlan nodded, the decision settling like stones in his chest. Compassion had birthed this bond, but survival demanded its evolution. As evening shadows lengthened, the highway's hum grew fainter, the reserve calling with rustles of leaves and hidden streams. He gathered the cubs' last meal, their eager chuffs a bittersweet symphony. Scout at his heels with a limp more pronounced. The air cooled, carrying the promise of night, and in the quiet, Harlan felt the moral suspense coil tighter, a choice between the safety of walls and the wild's unforgiving freedom. Ghost's gaze met his, stormy and knowing, as if urging him forward, while Scout pressed against his leg, her warmth a reminder of loyalties that transcended species. Outside, the trees whispered of horizons waiting, where the unthinkable brewed in the growing dark, testing the threads of their improbable family. The night air hung heavy with the scent of pine and impending rain, the reserve's edges blurring into a tapestry of shadow and silver moonlight that filtered through the canopy like hesitant confessions. Harlan's truck idled at the tree line, its engine a low growl muffled by the enveloping dark, headlights dimmed to avoid piercing the veil. The reinforced pen stood empty now, the chain-link gate unlatched, a silent testament to the choice made in the hush of afternoon deliberations. Lena's map lay folded on the dashboard, its paths etched into Harlan's mind like scars, leading to the glade where freedom whispered through the underbrush, far from prying eyes and the highway's indifferent roar. Scout paced the truck bed, her breaths coming in soft puffs that clouded the chill, her border collie frame taut with an unease that mirrored Harlan's own. The cubs, no longer cubs, but sleek juveniles with limbs like coiled springs, huddled in the back, their white forms pressed close in the makeshift crate, eyes gleaming with a mix of wariness and wild anticipation. Luna's massive head rested against the bars, her stormy gaze fixed on the forest's edge, nostrils flaring at the symphony of nocturnal life, rustles of small creatures fleeing, the distant hoot of an owl slicing the quiet. Shadow curled at her side, body still as mist, while Ember shifted restlessly, his tail flicking against the wood with impatient thuds. Ghost, ever the sentinel, lay nearest Scout, her paw extended through the slats to touch the dog's flank, a bridge of warmth in the cooling night. Harlan gripped the wheel, knuckles whitening, his heart a steady drum against the silence. Lena sat beside him, her hands clasped in her lap, face illuminated faintly by the dashboard glow, lines of resolve etched deeper than before. "It's the right thing," she murmured, voice barely rising above the engine's hum. But the words carried the weight of their shared moral crossroads. They'd planned it meticulously. Release in pairs under cover of darkness, Lena guiding the first two to the glade with radio collars for tracking, Harlan following with the rest at dawn's first light. Scout's role was the anchor, her presence to ease the transition, her scent a tether to the safety they'd known. But as the truck lurched forward onto the dirt path, ruts jolting the frame, Harlan felt the fracture widening, the bond they'd forged straining against the pull of instinct. The path wound deeper into the reserve, tires crunching over fallen branches that snapped like brittle bones underfoot. Scout whined low, her nose pressed to the cab's edge, sensing the shift in the air, the thickening musk of earth and untamed wild that called to the cubs with primal urgency. Luna responded first, her body tensing in the crate, a deep chuff escaping her throat that vibrated through the metal. Ember echoed it, his form rising to pace the confined space, shoulders rolling with a power that pressed against the sides. Harlan glanced in the rear view, throat tightening at the sight. These weren't the mewling orphans anymore, they were echoes of their mother, a fierce legacy awakening in sinew and stare. Ghost's eyes met his in the mirror, stormy and unblinking, holding a depth that stripped away pretense, a silent plea, or perhaps a farewell, born from months of shared breaths by the hearth. They reached the glade after what felt like hours, though the clock marked only 40 minutes, the moon now high, casting the clearing in ethereal light, where the creek murmured over smooth stones. Lena slipped out first, her flashlight a narrow beam guiding the way, voice soft as she unlatched the crate. Luna, Shadow, easy now. The two emerged like spectres, bodies unfolding into the night, fur rippling as they stretched, noses low to the ground. Luna paused. Turning back to nuzzle Scout through the truck's tailgate, her massive head dwarfing the dog's, a rumble of affection passing between them. Shadow followed, his form melting into the shadows, but he circled once, paw brushing Scout's side in a gesture of quiet loyalty. They vanished into the underbrush without a backward glance, the ferns swallowing their white shapes, leaving only the faint swish of tails and the echo of their mother's distant roar in Harlan's mind. Back in the cab, silence settled like dust after a storm. Scout's whine deepened, her body curling tighter in the bed, as if to hold on to the absence. Ember and Ghost stirred restlessly, their chuffs turning to low growls that set Harlan's pulse racing. Lena climbed in, face pale in the moonlight, radio crackling faintly with confirmation. The first pair safe in the glade, collars pinging steady signals. "It worked," she said, but her voice cracked, hands trembling as she gripped the door. Harlan nodded, starting the engine, the path back feeling longer, the weight of separation pressing like an unseen paw on his chest. Dawn crept in grey and reluctant, the second release unfolding in the same glade, now bathed in the soft haze of morning mist rising from the creek. Ember bounded out first, his energy a whirlwind that scattered dew from the grass, body launching into exploratory bounds that tested the air's freedom. He paused at the tree line, turning to Scout with a playful bow, but his eyes held a sharper glint, instincts honing to the hunt. Ghost emerged slower, her form graceful and measured, immediately seeking Scout's side. The dog leapt down, limping slightly but resolute, nosing the young tigress toward the woods. Ghost resisted at first, her body leaning into Scout's, a soft rumble vibrating between them, mother and child in spirit if not blood. Harlan watched from the truck, breath hitching as Ghost finally turned, her white coat blending with the fog, a final glance over her shoulder like a promise etched in silence. But as Ember vanished into the brush, a sharp yelp shattered the quiet. Scout's form stumbling back, her leg caught in a tangle of roots she'd overlooked in her focus. She hit the ground with a thud, the sound raw and vulnerable, her whine piercing the mist like a blade. Ghost wheeled around instantly, her massive frame charging back, body shielding the dog as she nosed the roots away. Ember reappeared, ears flat, circling protectively, their growls a unified warning to the empty air. Harlan rushed forward, heart slamming, kneeling beside Scout as her breaths came ragged, pain etching her loyal eyes. Lena was there in seconds, hands gentle on the limb, twisted, but not broken, the toll of months finally claiming its due. In that moment, as Ghost's warmth enveloped Scout, her paw resting lightly on the dog's chest, Harlan saw the revelation unfold. These tigers, raised in the shadow of compassion, hadn't forgotten. Their wild hearts, forged in the cabin's firelight, carried the bond deeper than species or survival. Tears blurred his vision, unshed until now, the moral suspense resolving not in loss, but in a quiet justice, the unthinkable not betrayal, but a fierce instinctual loyalty that bridged the divide. The creek's murmur softened, the mist lifting to reveal the glade's green heart. And for the first time, Harlan breathed freely, the weight of redemption settling like morning light. Scout's eyes met his, steady despite the pain, and in the hush, the forest held its breath, honoring the family that had defied the wild's cruel odds. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of this white tiger reach more people who still believe in kindness. The mist clung to the glade like a shroud, softening the edges of ferns and stones into a dreamlike haze. where the creek's murmur blended with the ragged cadence of Scout's breaths. Harlan knelt in the damp earth, his hands steady on her twisted leg, the warmth of her fur seeping through his calluses like a fading ember. Lena worked beside him, her movements precise and hushed, splinting the limb with branches and strips of cloth torn from her jacket, no words passing between them, only the shared rhythm of care amid the forest's indifferent hush. Scout lay still, her eyes half-lidded in pain, but unyielding, her gaze flicking toward the tree line where Ember and Ghost had paused, their massive forms silhouetted against the rising light, ears pricked and bodies tensed. Ghost moved first, her white coat parting the mist like a spectre reborn. Padding back with a grace that belied her power, she lowered her head to Scout's side, not nuzzling but standing sentinel, her flank pressed close enough to share body heat, a low rumble vibrating from her chest, a sound not of threat, but of comfort, echoing the nights by the cabin hearth. Ember followed, circling wide, his paws silent on the moss, positioning himself between the group and the path they'd come. The air thickened with their presence, the scent of wild musk mingling with the clean sharpness of dew, and Harlan felt the weight of it settle. These tigers, raised on a dog's devotion, had woven loyalty into their instincts, turning the unthinkable into something profound, a bridge across the chasm of species, forged in silence and survival. But the forest wasn't empty. A distant crackle pierced the quiet, not the snap of branches under paw, but the crunch of tires on gravel, growing nearer from the reserve's access road. Harlan's pulse quickened, his hand freezing mid-stroke on Scout's ear. Lena's head snapped up, her breath hitching as she scanned the mist. "Authorities," she whispered, voice taut as wire. "Someone must have seen the truck last night. Tracks in the mud." The revelation hung unspoken. The town's whispers had caught wind, perhaps Tommy at the pumps piecing together Harlan's secretive runs, or Mrs. Ellis noting the extra meat vanishing from shelves. White tigers weren't folklore here. They were liabilities, poacher bait, threats to the fragile balance of ranches and roads. If the rangers arrived, it wouldn't be with questions, but with tranks and cages, severing the bonds before they could fully form. The engine's rumble swelled, headlights flickering through the trees like accusatory eyes. Ghost's ears flattened, her body coiling low, a growl building deep in her throat that set the leaves trembling. Ember mirrored her, his form expanding with the raw majesty of adolescence, stripes stark against white as he planted himself in the path. Scout stirred weakly, trying to rise, her whine a plea that cut through Harlan's chest sharper than any blade. He pressed her down gently, mind racing through fragments of memory, his daughter's final days, the helplessness of watching life ebb under fluorescent lights, the tigress's dying gaze in the clearing, entrusting her young to strangers. He'd failed then, bound by grief and inaction. But here, redemption demanded he stand, not as savior, but as witness to the strength Scout had instilled. Lena gathered her kit, eyes meeting Harlan's in a silent pact. "Get her to the truck. I'll stall them." She rose, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, stepping toward the sound as if drawn by fate. The truck's lights breached the glade now, 2 ranger vehicles pulling up short, doors slamming with the finality of judgment. Figures emerged, uniformed men with rifles slung low, faces hardened by protocol, one barking questions into the mist. "Jenkins, that you? Reports of activity. White cats on the loose." Lena intercepted them, her words a calm barrier. "Just a routine check. Injured dog, nothing more." But doubt flickered in their eyes, beams sweeping the underbrush where Ghost and Ember held their ground, shadows merging with white forms that refused to yield. Harlan lifted Scout carefully, her weight familiar yet heavier now, her head lolling against his shoulder as he backed toward the truck. Ghost shadowed him every step, her body a living shield, nudging Scout's dangling paws with her muzzle as if urging her to fight. Ember's growl deepened, a warning that rippled through the air, holding the rangers at bay without a charge. Their instincts honed, not for aggression, but for protection. A silent justice born from the cabin's quiet lessons. One ranger raised his rifle, sighting through the scope, but Lena's voice cut sharp. "Stand down. They're not threats. They're family." The word hung, reframing the scene, and in that pause, Harlan saw the late truth unfold. Scout wasn't just a caretaker, she was the moral heart, her unwavering bond revealing the rescuer's own depths. Harlan had lost his way once, but through her, he'd found purpose, compassion not as weakness, but as the force that tamed the wild's edge. He reached the truck, easing Scout into the bed where blankets waited, her breaths steadying against the pain. Ghost leaped up beside her without hesitation, curling around the dog in a protective arc, her massive paw draping gently over Scout's splintered leg. Ember held the line a moment longer, then bounded after, his form squeezing into the space. The three tigers, four, but Luna and Shadow already deeper in the glade, forming a fortress of fur and fidelity. The rangers hesitated, rifles lowering as Lena's explanations wove a fragile truce. No cages, no seizures, just a promise of monitoring. The white tiger's rarity, earning them a whispered amnesty in the face of such loyalty. As Harlan gunned the engine, the truck lurching back toward the highway, the mist parted to reveal the glade's heart, Luna and Shadow emerging from the trees, their calls joining the chorus, guiding the way home not to captivity, but to a monitored wild where bonds could endure. The road ahead stretched empty, engines cooling in the distance, cold morning yielding to tentative sun. Scout's eyes met Harlan's in the rear view, pain softened by peace, her tail thumping faintly against Ghost's side. In the weeks that followed, the reserve became a sanctuary of watchful peace, the tigers roaming the glade under Lena's distant eye, their white forms blending with legend, while Scout healed in the cabin's warmth. Visits from her adopted kin, a ritual of nose-to-nose greetings through the fence. Harlan watched from the porch, coffee steaming in his grip, the highway's hum a distant song of survival. Compassion had sparked this tale, fear tested it, but instinct sealed it, humans and wild confronting morality in shared breaths, finding redemption in the quiet act of letting go. And as dusk fell one evening, Harlan saw them, Ghost leading Luna, Shadow and Ember into the horizon, their silhouettes strong against the fading light. A family unbroken by the unthinkable, walking toward untamed horizons where kindness echoed in every paw step. The frost of that first morning had thawed into memory, leaving a world where every roar and breath mattered, proving that behind the majesty of the white tiger lay stories of hope, loyalty, and the silent connections that redefine us all. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching the case of Dog raised 3 white tiger cubs, but when they grew up, the unthinkable happened. See you in the next one.